There is a name sitting quietly in your family tree that was never supposed to survive. For centuries, it passed from father to son, then father to son again, carried through wars, migrations, famines, and empires that rose and collapsed around it. And somewhere in that unbroken chain, it carried something else too, something written not in ink, but in chromosomes. A signature older than any written record. A signature that, until recently, no one thought to read. Historians have always told the Viking story with confidence. Raiders from the north. Longships cutting through gray water. A culture defined by conquest, trade, and blood. It is one of the most romanticized chapters in European history, and one of the most misunderstood. Because the story we inherited was built mostly from sagas, monastery records written by the people the Vikings raided, and a handful of burial sites. It was never built from the Vikings themselves. Then geneticists opened the graves. And what came out of the soil did not simply confirm the legend. It complicated it, thread by thread, until the picture of who the Vikings actually were, and who their descendants actually are, began to look nothing like the poster version we grew up with. This is the story of what DNA found hiding inside some of the oldest surnames in Northern Europe. Names like Ragnvald, Thorson, Hardrada-linked lines, Skarsgård, Ulfson, and a dozen others still spoken today, often without anyone realizing what they might be carrying. For most of history, a surname was one of the few things passed down almost exactly like DNA itself. In patrilineal societies, and early Scandinavia was overwhelmingly one, a son inherited his father's name the same way he inherited his father's Y chromosome. Not identical mechanisms, but strikingly parallel paths. Which meant that certain Old Norse surnames, especially ones tied to specific clans, chieftain lines, or regional strongholds, may have been riding alongside a genetic marker for over 1,000 years, generation after generation, largely undisturbed. That is the theory historians and geneticists have quietly explored for the last 2 decades. Surname studies. The idea that a name can act as a kind of low-resolution map to a Y chromosome lineage, especially in populations where surnames were rare, regional, and slow to change. And Viking Age Scandinavia was exactly that kind of population. Small, dispersed, fiercely regional, with naming conventions passed almost like heirlooms. It seemed, for a while, like a clean story. Old name. Old blood. A living fossil hiding in a phone book. Then the first cracks appeared. Because when researchers began comparing the Y chromosome markers linked to certain historic Norse surnames against the actual ancient DNA pulled from Viking Age burial sites, the match was not as clean as expected. Some names lined up beautifully with a distinct Northern European lineage. Others didn't line up at all. A surname associated for centuries with a particular Norwegian coastal clan carried a Y chromosome signature that pointed somewhere else entirely, somewhere further south, further east, somewhere that had no business being in a pure, Viking bloodline, according to the old assumptions. Something was off. Not broken. This is where the science had to step in, because sagas and folklore could not answer the question anymore. Only the genome could. Researchers turned to 3 main tools. Mitochondrial DNA, passed almost unchanged from mother to child, offering a window into maternal ancestry stretching back thousands of years. Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son, tracking the same kind of paternal line inheritance that surnames were built on. And whole genome sequencing, which does not follow a single line at all, but instead reconstructs the full, tangled inheritance of a person, every ancestor, every population, every layer, compressed into one dataset. Ancient DNA extracted from Viking Age skeletons, teeth mostly, because the enamel protects genetic material for centuries, gave scientists something the sagas never could. A direct, unfiltered record. Not what people wrote about the Vikings. What the Vikings actually were, at the molecular level. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where the evidence quietly rewrites what we thought we knew, consider subscribing. There is a great deal more hidden in the human past than most of us were ever taught. And what the evidence revealed did not simply confirm the old warrior bloodline image. It widened it in a direction almost no one expected. The genome did not describe a single Viking people. It described several. Large-scale ancient DNA analysis. Most notably a landmark 2020 study published in Nature that sequenced the genomes of hundreds of Viking Age individuals from across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and beyond, found that the Viking world was genetically far more diverse than the sagas ever suggested. Some individuals buried with full Viking weaponry, Viking rite, Viking symbolism, carried little to no Scandinavian ancestry at all. Their genetic ancestry pointed toward southern Europe, toward the Baltic, toward populations with no obvious connection to the fjords and longhouses associated with the Viking homeland. In other words, the DNA suggested something the old story never allowed for. You did not necessarily have to be born Scandinavian to become, culturally and socially, a Viking. That single finding cracked the foundation of the old narrative. Viking identity, the evidence suggested, was not purely a bloodline. It was, at least in part, a cultural and social identity, one that people from very different ancestral backgrounds could apparently step into. But that was only the first layer. Because when researchers focused specifically on the Y chromosome lines connected to surviving Norse surnames, the male line inheritance patterns tied to names still carried by families today, a second, quieter pattern emerged. Some of these deep paternal lineages did trace convincingly back to ancient Scandinavian populations, largely undisturbed for over 1,000 years. Genuine continuity. A living thread stretching from a Bronze Age settlement to a modern name on a birth certificate. Others did not. Some surnames long assumed to represent pure, Old Norse patrilines instead traced back to Y chromosome haplogroups more commonly associated with populations from the eastern Baltic, or, in a smaller number of cases, from populations with deep roots in the British Isles, the very regions the Vikings raided, traded with, settled among, and, over centuries, intermarried into. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. It suggested that at some point, a war captive, a trade alliance, a marriage, a settlement, an absorption of an outsider into a clan through means the historical record no longer preserves, a paternal line from outside Scandinavia was folded into a Norse family, and the name continued forward exactly as if nothing unusual had happened. Because to the people living it, nothing unusual had happened. Kinship absorbed people. Surnames did not always demand genetic purity to be inherited. They demanded belonging. There are, broadly, 3 explanations researchers have put forward for these mismatched lines, and it is worth sitting with all 3, because none of them has been fully confirmed over the others. The first is direct intermarriage during the Viking Age itself, unions between Norse settlers and local populations across the British Isles, Frankish territories, and the Baltic coast, with the resulting sons carrying the father's Norse surname forward while carrying a very different paternal genetic signal underneath it. The second is adoption or fosterage, a documented practice in early medieval Scandinavian society, where a boy from outside the bloodline could be formally raised within a clan, inherit its name, its status, sometimes its land, and, generations later, leave no trace in the historical record except a Y chromosome that quietly does not match the family legend. The third, and the most unsettling for anyone hoping for a tidy answer, is what researchers sometimes call a ghost lineage event, a population contact so far back in prehistory, long before the Viking Age even began, that it left a genetic signature in a region's founding population which later generations, and later surnames, simply inherited without anyone ever knowing an outside group had been involved at all. Not a Viking-era event. A pre-Viking layer, buried under 1,000 years of assumed purity. Scientists remain cautious about which of these explanations applies to which surname. The honest answer, for most lineages, is possibly more than one. Then came the study that changed the scale of the entire conversation. The 2020 Nature genome analysis was not a small sample. It compared ancient DNA from hundreds of Viking Age skeletons against a modern reference panel spanning tens of thousands of individuals across Europe. That scale mattered because smaller, earlier studies had been forced to guess at patterns from a handful of graves. This dataset could actually test whether the old assumptions held up against population-level evidence. They largely did not. The study found that Scandinavia during the Viking Age was already a genetically layered region before the raids even began, carrying ancestry from earlier Bronze Age migrations, from hunter-gatherer populations that had lived in the north for thousands of years prior, and from waves of farming populations that had moved in from the south millennia earlier still. The Viking genome, in other words, was never a pure, self-contained starting point. It was already a composite by the time the first longship ever left the coast. And that is the twist the sagas never told you. Not that the Vikings mixed with the people they encountered, that much was always assumed. The real surprise was that Vikingness itself, from the very beginning, was built on layers of much older, largely forgotten population movements. The bloodline people imagined stretching back to some untouched Nordic origin point does not exist, because that origin point was never untouched to begin with. The surname you carry, if it traces to this world, is not a single thread. It is closer to a rope, many strands, many origins, twisted together so tightly over 1,000 years that they now appear, to the naked eye, as one solid line. This matters beyond genealogy. It matters because it forces a reconsideration of how identity has always worked, in every population, in every era. Bloodlines are not pure. They were never meant to be read as pure. Every surname, every clan, every ancient people, is, underneath the surface, a record of movement, of people arriving, staying, marrying in, being absorbed, and being forgotten by the very family that carried their genes forward. Picture, for a moment, a fjord in early spring. Mist sitting low over black water. A longhouse with smoke rising through a single opening in the roof. Inside, a family sits around a fire. A father, a mother, sons who will carry the family name into raids, into trade routes, into marriages in lands they have not yet seen. None of them know what a chromosome is. None of them will ever read a genome. And yet everything about who their descendants will become, 1,000 years later, is already being written in that fire-lit room, not by ideology, not by purity, but by every relationship, every alliance, every quiet act of belonging that history did not think to record. That is the part the old story missed. It treated ancestry like a straight line drawn backward through time. The genome treats it like a delta, a river breaking into channels, rejoining, splitting again, carrying sediment from 100 different sources until it reaches the sea looking, from a distance, like a single stream. If your surname traces to this world, the DNA is not telling you that your Viking ancestry is fake. It is telling you something more interesting than that. It is telling you that the name you carry is a survivor, not of one bloodline, but of an entire, tangled, remarkably human history of contact, absorption, and continuity that no saga was ever detailed enough to capture. The old story gave you a warrior with a single, unbroken line back to the north. The genome gives you something more honest. A family shaped by centuries of arrivals. A name that outlived the people it first belonged to. A signature, hidden in your cells, of every quiet moment when someone from outside was let in, and the line simply continued, unbothered by where it had truly come from. The map is still incomplete. New ancient genomes are recovered every year, and each one has the potential to rewrite another surname's assumed history. What the evidence has made clear so far is enough to sit with. The Viking bloodline you inherited was never simple, never pure, and never finished being written. It is still being read, one grave, one genome, one forgotten name at a time. If there is a name, a people, or a hidden ancestry story you want uncovered next, leave it in the comments. Some of the most surprising discoveries start exactly that way.